Hey, all you experts out there, this is the Monetize Your Expertise podcast, where we show you how to use your skills to pay the bills. Have you ever wanted to create a business that positions you as the industry leader and go-to expert? Join me every week to hear from amazing leaders and entrepreneurs who have successfully refined their skills in order to become experts and create extremely profitable knowledge businesses. To find all of the links and tools mentioned in this episode, just go to myepodcast.com. I'm your host, Grant Weherley, the online course guy, helping you every week to monetize your expertise. Hey everybody, and thanks for joining me. Today I'm here with Graham Brown from Barefoot Journal and also author of Fire Your Boss, Sell Your Car, and Travel the World. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Grant. Pleasure to be here with you.
Yeah, so you told me before that you're located in Spain at the moment, right?
Correct, in the south.
Okay, what's the name of the city?
Malaga. It's
I've
in
never
what they
heard of
call
that.
it's in what they call the Costa del Sol, so the sunny coast. It's sort of one of the nicer parts of Spain, right down on the Mediterranean.
Nice. And what's life like there?
Yeah, it's good. It's a good mix, Grant. You've got the local Spanish culture and you've got a lot of tourists as well. So you can dip into both worlds. You get sort of access to real Spain, you know, the tapas and the Spanish mañana laid back lifestyle, siestas, that kind of thing. I know if you drive into the mountains, you've got the white villages, you know, the Andalusian villages, very traditional. But at the same time, you've got all the modern conveniences you'd expect that a lot of the tourists come for, so the supermarkets and so on. So it's a good mix.
That's awesome. And so what are some other places that you've lived in the past?
Well, in the past, I've moved around a lot. I'm from England originally, but I've lived in Japan, Tokyo. I've lived in a tropical island off the west coast of Africa called Lanzarote, which is really just a rock in the middle of the sea. It's about 200 kilometers off the west coast of Morocco. But it's, so we lived there for 18 months on our travels. It's an amazing place if you're into sport, it's particularly sort of outdoor sports and training. It's a bit of a mecca for Europeans to go there and train, especially for the Ironman triathlon.
Interesting.
Yeah, it attracts a lot of Northern Europeans to go down there so they can train around the year. So you've got a really good mix of athletes and, you know, elite amateurs and so on. That's great down there. And we lived as well for some time on an island called Okinawa, which is sort of between Japan and Taiwan. And it's another tropical island in the middle of nowhere. But it's it's an amazing place. Obviously, it's the birthplace of karate, and among other claims to fame. Yeah, that's a great island.
But here's the question. Did you end up learning karate?
No, I didn't. My son does. He learns it. But the karate that they learn in Okinawa is pretty hardcore. It's unlike the sort of the stuff that you get in the West, quote unquote, is more sporty. But in Okinawa, it's more pure. So even for little kids, it's a little bit tough, right? So, you know, we went to one of the dojos and the sensei, the instructor, pulled out a sword. Right, so it was a little bit intimidating for an 8-year-old boy. So I didn't learn, but it's a great place. It was an interesting cultural mix as well. It's sort of a mix of China and Japan thrown in. But after 3 years of living on tropical islands, we felt we needed to get back to the mainland.
Yeah, and so how long has it been total that you've been traveling so far?
Well, this time 3 years. We've since we left England, but before that, I lived in Japan, in Tokyo, for 2 years during my sort of after graduation. So yeah. Any
favorites so far?
Of the places I've lived?
Yes.
Well, I love Spain, Grant. I think it's a great place. The real downside about Spain is if you've got to work here.
Oh yeah, why is that?
Well, if you're young in Spain, I think the unemployment rate's about 40 to 50%.
Oh yeah, I've heard that before.
It's pretty severe. So, that's really the nature of Spain at the moment. So if you're young or you need to work in Spain, it's bad. And that's why if you look at all those, those world life quality indexes, Spain ranks pretty low because of work. But if you live in Spain but work somewhere else, like online, it's fantastic. And there's a real boom at the moment of startups in Spain as a result, and a lot of Europeans and Americans as well moving to Spain to really sort of check that out. Barcelona is a real hotspot at the moment.
Yeah, that's what I've heard. And it sounds like there's some similarities, I guess. For example, Southeast Asia is probably not the best place to live as a native in terms of how much you make per average hourly wage is insanely low. Like I've heard 20 baht per hour, which is like 60 cents per hour for people who live in Chiang Mai, for example. But if you come here as a Westerner, or if you come here with an internet business, then it's actually a very, very amazing lifestyle and flips that on its head. So really interesting. So tell me a little bit about the current projects that you're focusing on now.
Well, I'm involved a lot in helping startups, especially in the tech space, whether I'm some startups, for example, in the mobile video space, helping them as an advisor to the board. And that's sort of based on my experience. I've been involved in telecoms for 15 years now, so I have a good network of contacts. So I'm involved with them, helping startups, whether as an advisor or as an investor, and just really, my own projects as well, being marketing and research based on telecoms. That's my background. And the other things I'm involved in, I've got a number of things. Obviously, Barefoot Journal, which is my story and sort of helping other people get onto the road, get started in their journey, whether they're employed or whether they're running their own business. Yeah, so I mean, I'm sort of one of those people, not a serial entrepreneur, Grant, but a parallel entrepreneur. I've got a lot of projects on the go at the moment because I think that just sort of interests me. That's the lifestyle I enjoy. Whether it's technology or real estate or mentoring, coaching young startups, it helps me feel challenged mentally, because I think if I was involved in one project alone, I think I couldn't be able to do it at this stage. Maybe if I was younger, but now I sort of have the ability to do that. It's kind of it's the best of both worlds. I get to work with these companies. They do all the heavy lifting of that's running the companies and starting them up, but I can actually be part of that process.
Interesting. Yeah, and I think it's a really good point. So it sounds like you're a big fan of diversification.
Yeah, I think we live in an age where it's possible, don't you? I mean, it's sort of, I think when I graduated well over, so many years ago, I forget now, 20 plus years ago, that when I graduated, the idea was you got one job. But particularly for the generation graduating now, it just seems a ridiculous notion that you have one job at the same time. I mean, there's no job security anymore, right? So you've got to have a lot of projects on the go. So I think it's the future, right?
So would you recommend that? I mean, because you mentioned that you sort of have the position to be able to do that. Would you also recommend that kind of diversification approach to people who are maybe it is 20 something years ago for them and they're just getting started, they've just graduated and they're getting started? Would you recommend getting started that way, or would you recommend maybe working up to the ability to diversify?
Yeah, I mean, if you had a job now, let's say you graduated 20 years ago, you should be well established in your career, but you're probably looking ahead in your career. There isn't a lot of advancement from there, so you could invest some of your time and start a business on the side, right? That's easier than ever to start a business. You could invest 4 or 5 hours at the weekend and build a website. You could start an affiliate business. You could start a drop shipping business. You could set up as a consultancy. You could sell information products. It's limitless, the possibilities now. Your point about building up to, I think that comes from educating yourself about what's possible. And I think, the more you open the door on this world of internet marketing or internet business, the more you see, wow, I didn't realize you could do that. And I'm sure you get this as well, Grant. You're in Chiang Mai, right? You must just encounter people you think, wow, I didn't know you could do that stuff online, right?
Very true.
So I think that's the work, right? I mean, have you experienced that? Have you sort of bumped into people and thought, wow, I never thought that was possible? I'm sure that's what people need to build up to, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, I remember having that kind of thought myself, just kind of when I first got exposed to the idea of, online business, and that's a very, like, being self-employed through an online business and how it's a very legitimate thing. Lots of people are doing it. When I first learned about that the first time, I had that exact reaction. I was like, oh, that's a thing? Like, I kind of realized it's a hypothetical thing, but I didn't realize it's a real thing that people actually did.
Exactly. I mean, like this, I'm not involved in it, but I know people who are involved in Amazon FBA, which is fulfillment by Amazon, where you basically ship products from China, which you have made in China, and you get them sold on Amazon. So people are getting all these kind of things, from furniture to drones made in China, sold on Amazon, but they're living somewhere in Vietnam or Thailand. I mean, the possibilities now are endless. So back to your point about building up to it, I think it's just getting out there, networking, and seeing what's possible, because really will blow your mind what's possible right now.
So what's the story behind how you guys started doing that kind of thing? How you had that first realization, or did you do it from the get-go? Did you have a traditional kind of job that you branched out from? What was the story behind that?
Well, back in the 90s, I graduated, and the 90s wasn't a great era to graduate in if you were looking for a job. It's probably quite similar economically to today. And I looked around and thought, well, what am I going to do? And I wanted to travel. So I remember going one day to the careers office and sitting down and looking through a folder. And I found advertisements for teaching in Japan. And this was the mid-90s. And at the time, Japan was still like the place to go. Pretty much like people talk about China today. But back then, it was the Japanese bubble. So I applied. And the next minute, I knew I was flying out to Japan to teach English in Tokyo. And from that moment, I think I decided that I didn't want a normal existence, because the thought of, my friends back home and getting their jobs in the big blue chip companies, the big Fortune 500 companies, really didn't appeal to me. So I spent years in Japan living in Tokyo. And it was interesting because at the time, Tokyo, Japan was just undergoing the mobile phone boom. So this was the time where they were just introducing these really small phones aimed at young people. And, back home, we were still carrying these bricks around. I don't know if you remember those big, they're like the size of a Kleenex box. Exactly. Original phones. So, coming back from Japan at that time, seeing people using these phones and how they marketed them. And, my background was psychology and IT computing. So I was always interested in consumer behavior. I was always interested in IT. And then going back home and seeing people walking around with these bricks, I thought, wow, there's a big gap here. I understand Japan. I understand how they market these technologies. But I didn't know how to get into that scene. So, I started out getting a foot into the IT industry by literally building computers with a friend and selling them to companies. And this was sort of 96, before the dot-com boom. So people were buying computers like crazy. So I could make good money, and then we started selling websites at the time where you could sell a website for $10,000, and you could buy a website now for $10, right? That's how crazy it was. You could literally phone up a company and say, "Hey, I want to sell you a website. Are you interested?" And you could have a meeting that day. So those were different times, and that was really my start in IT and technology. I sort of got in at the beginning of the dot-com era, and from that developed into organizing networking events, literally in bars for people interested in IT and so on. So we could sell them websites. And from that going into telecoms, because that sort of closed the loop of my interest in Japan.
So if you were going to host them in bars, was part of your sales strategy then to get them super drunk in order to buy your product? Or?
Yeah, it always helps. It's sort of, it helps with signing the paperwork. But no, seriously, it's I think, it's all part of the networking process. I mean, it was very dot-com at the time as well, because people were so unused to that kind of networking that it was all kind of part of that scene. We're going to do things differently. But it was great. I mean, I still have friends from that time, from that era. And, you form a lot of relationships. There's a lot of mobility, a lot of people leaving traditional companies and, trying things out in dot-com and so on. So it's a great time to really get in. If you had no experience like me, it was a great time to sort of establish yourself as a leader, just by planting a flag in the ground and saying, hey, look, I understand this, right? So there was an opportunity and I took it. And from that, I moved into telecoms. And that was really my thing. I was doing telecoms research for 15 years and built a very profitable business that had clients all over the world. And that allowed me to travel, to places like Africa and Middle East and Asia.
So can you elaborate on the telecoms business? Because I think I'm not exactly sure what you mean. I'm sure there's other people listening who probably don't know exactly what you mean by that as well.
Right. We had a research business. So we were selling a market research about mobile telecom. So if you think way back to like 2000, you got companies like AT&T, Nokia, Intel, Microsoft, all involved in that space. And nobody knew what was going on. So we were writing reports and saying, hey, this is what customers want. This is what young people want. These are the technologies that they want. And, if you go back then, we're talking like SMS. They wanted reports about SMS. Like, how do young people use text messaging? What's the future of text messaging? How can we make money out of text messaging? So there was a massive opportunity to provide information in that gap. And that's what we did because nobody else was doing it.
Okay, so that makes sense. So I'm doing market research for large telephone companies, correct?
Yeah, I mean, selling reports effectively. Those were like information products before, I even heard that word. So, these were like reports that cost anywhere between $3,000 and $15,000, right? So there was a lot of money around at the time, and people were throwing money at these problems, which they didn't understand their customers.
Interesting. And so that's probably led to where you are today, right? I know one of the big areas you focus on nowadays also relates to marketing and understanding your customers. Would you say that's probably the main area that you focus on nowadays with your projects?
Yeah, I think in terms of hours and time, it's mainly marketing focused because everything comes down to marketing. You can have a great product, but if you can't market and sell that product, well, it doesn't make any difference, does it? Marketing is everything that organizations do today, and increasingly so. Increasingly, people are realizing that they have to spend more on it. They have to invest in it. They have to understand their customers better. And if you look at all the brands, the companies that touch our daily lives, right? Companies like Apple or Starbucks or whoever, these companies are completely marketing focused. So we're seeing a big shift. That's the way business is going. Understand customers.
I would absolutely agree with that. Actually, I was reading Seth Godin's idea virus the other day, and that was one of the things he pointed out, which I thought was really interesting, which is, maybe 50 years ago, you make a really nice product, and maybe if it's cheaper than the competition, people just buy it. It's pretty simple, right? And then nowadays, the main focus of most businesses and most industries actually very much revolves around marketing and getting your message out there, getting some picture you're painting about your product out there and having that put out there much more strongly than any of your competition. So yeah, I think that's the kinds of expertise you have and the services you provide are very essential for almost any industry.
For sure. I mean, you take a great example of, Seth Godin's a fantastic author. He's influenced me greatly. So I'm pleased that you brought that up. I think he's a real leading light in this industry.
Absolutely.
And helping people rethink, not just in marketing, but business in general. And I think it all comes down to change. I mean, that's what Seth Godin writes about, change. And there is change in business today, and there's change that big businesses don't have the advantages that they used to. A small guy can get into the market and play on the same level as these big businesses. And we're seeing businesses that once were untouchable now going out of business. So there's so much change now. And I think what he writes about is getting outside of your comfort zone. And, it's a very difficult area to take on board because, if you're trained in going to school, getting a good job, and then graduating, getting the nice high back leather chair and the corner office with the air conditioning and the MBA, all that kind of stuff, you're not trained to step outside your comfort zone. You're trained into becoming more and more comfortable. So I think the challenge now for businesses, big and small, is how can they adapt? How can they evolve constantly? And that's really what marketing's about as well. And that's really where I come in.
So what are the kinds of things you try and focus on with clients and businesses that you work with in terms of marketing? What are the areas that you think people tend to go wrong most often? And what are some things that you think on average people should be more focused on or spend some more time doing?
So if I was to take some of my clients who I do consultancy for, which is more like a mentoring type role, I would say there's a recurring theme, which is this. You're a small startup company and you have an existing client base. And let's say, for example, you're an app developer and you're selling that app and people are telling you about this app. They're giving you feedback about this app, and you have a conviction about, yes, this is exactly what the world needs. I've got to develop this app, right? I've got to get this out there. But you're getting a lot of resistance. So people are telling you things like, you've got to edit this, you've got to change it, you've got to make it less, reduce the strength of the message that you're putting out there, make it less offensive, make it more conform to what else is out there. Don't be so individual and all these kind of things. I think what these startup owners, these small company CEOs face is the negativity of the market. And a key part of marketing is focusing on your core message and believing what you do. What I advise a lot of my customers is to focus on their fans. Find the 10%, and this can apply to your listeners as well, Grant. Find the 10% of your customer base who love what you do and focus all your energies on them. Right? Focus on your fans and not your customers, because it's the fans who really need what you offer, right? Because even in any market, whether you're a consultant or an app developer, you have customers and fans, and the customers are there because of the transaction, but the fans are there because there's an emotional relationship with that product or with you. And that's the key transition, is that a lot of people say, oh, I don't realize that. I've been spending my time trying to convert customers or convert the people who don't get it, right? And that could be people in your own team. It could be your customers, whoever. Trying to, wasting your energies on people who will never come around to becoming a fan, right? And rather focusing all that energy on the people who really need it and getting them to then to go out there and to influence the market. So I think that's how marketing is today. Finding your fans, find that 10% who influences the 90% and commit all your resources to them. And that's what big companies do, and it's what startups do that works.
I think that's great advice. And just to play the devil's advocate just a little bit. So if somebody's in that situation and they're facing that kind of resistance, how do you differentiate between the situation that you're describing where it's maybe they're focusing on the wrong people versus it's actually good feedback and you should listen to it? So like, how do you, it's one of the biggest questions in marketing that I've always thought of and haven't found a definitive answer to, is how do you differentiate between being a trendsetter and getting legitimate feedback of like, you should actually listen to what people are telling you?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. And the way you phrase it, I mean, I think of Steve Jobs. A lot of people used to say that Steve Jobs didn't do market research. And his market research was he would look in the mirror in the morning. That's sort of the myth about Apple. And they said, well, they don't do market research. They're just a trendsetter. But the reality is that, 2/3 of Apple employees work in the retail store, right? That is their market research. That's their feedback. Right? That the fact is that they know every day when they talk to people and they interact with people, they're getting really positive feedback or negative feedback about products and services. So even trendsetters have to take on board feedback. But the question is from who, right? So, Apple's not taking feedback from Android fans, right? It's taking feedback from the Apple people that walk through the store every day. And I'm reminding of a story, just slightly different context, of DC Comics, who obviously produced Batman and that series, right? The Dark Knight and so on. I mean, there's a story some years ago where DC wanted to make their comics more interactive. So they polled their readership, what should happen next with this Batman story? Should Batman die? Should Robin die? And it was kind of one of those beginnings of interactive media. We're talking sort of 20 years ago, where comics were trying to stay relevant to a younger audience, all that kind of thing. And what happened is that the readers voted for Robin to die in the next episode. It was like kind of choose your own adventure type thing. But, it was kind of a thing where actually the real fans didn't want Robin to die, but a lot of the readers wanted Robin to die. So, they killed him off. But eventually they overturned that decision and came back and said, actually, that was a bad idea. That was based on feedback from customers, right? The customers wanted to do it because it was kind of an interesting thing to do, to kill Robin off. But ultimately, the real fans, the people who are the hardcore buyers of the comics, who had been buying comics for years and didn't really care about whether it was interactive or not, wanted to keep them alive. So it's kind of like you can listen to the wrong people. And I think that's the problem, right? If you've got a product or a service, make sure you listen to the right people. Get feedback from people who care, not feedback from people who are just there and vocal, right? Because that can be banging your head against the wall type feedback, and people who don't care about your product.
Yeah, that reminds me of just general advice about dealing with people and getting ideas and getting feedback in general, is that people who have the loudest voices don't always have the best or most productive opinions. They might just be extremely vocable, and they might just be haters, and maybe you should just totally ignore them, especially online, if you're getting feedback through online channels, because people tend to have very overly loud, sometimes very overly negative feedback, which could cause you to maybe lose confidence or change directions with your current project, and only to not serve the silent majority, which actually loves your product.
Yeah. Have you ever read the feedback on any of the Amazon pages for Seth Godin's books? It's kind of interesting that he gets like 3 stars, 3.5 stars for his book. And for me, like most of his books are sort of 4 or 5 stars. Some of them are 6 stars if possible.
Yeah.
But if you look at the general feedback, I think I'm surprised they're quite poor.
Yeah, I'm always because I've heard such great things because he does definitely have super fans, and if you read any of his books, they're kind of different. I've seen lots of 5 star or like 4.7 star or what have you books that I actually don't really think they're that good. They're just kind of trendy almost. Whereas he has his own style, and I can see why he might polarize people more strongly than the average sort of trendy book. But I guess that's, it's a very strong testament to what you're saying right now, which is focus on making your fans really happy, even at the cost of making people who aren't your fans unhappy, because who cares about them?
Exactly. That's kind of hard for a startup though, right? You've got to take on every bit of business that you can take to stay afloat. So that's the decision that you need to make as soon as you get going is learning to say no. And I think if you look at every great company, every great brand, every great startup, they've learned to say no along the way. So they've learned to say no to potential partnerships or taking the company in certain directions or a potential type of customer, because that's helped them grow by understanding what you're not about and who you're not selling to. So, I mean, a good exercise that I do with my clients is to help them really focus on, that customer profile, but also focusing on the kind of people they don't want as customers. And that's hard because we're so used to saying, right, get every piece of business possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a scary thing, I think, for a lot of people. I mean, I've made the mistake as well, taking on clients where I'm like, definitely not my ideal client. I might regret taking on this client. And inevitably, it's just never worth it. And it just puts you in the wrong direction. And I think a lot of people actually have to learn that the hard way, because I'd heard this before, what you're saying. And I had heard that. And then I was like, oh, well, I'm still going to make the decision everybody makes and take on the business anyways. And ended up, of course, regretting it.
Did you sort of go through a red light with that client early on, something that in your gut you thought, this doesn't feel right?
Yes, absolutely. Exactly. Had that moment of like, I don't know if I should take this person on. Actually, a couple of times, mostly 2 situations. And I learned my lesson after the second one. But for those both situations, I had a gut feeling that it was a bad idea. And it very, very much was. Massive headache, not even close to being worth it.
And you kick yourself afterwards because you said, look, the signs are there. Day one, I should have known, right? And that's kind of the lesson that we learn. I think that's a great startup lesson, isn't it? And that's what I've learned. The ball breakers, the clients that are just misery are the ones that you kind of knew earlier on that this ain't going to work out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I guess in some ways I wouldn't really regret taking them on because it was learning the lesson the hard way. But sometimes when you learn the lesson the hard way, it drives it home that much more strongly.
That is true. There's no better way to learn.
Yeah. So I'll remember that one for a long time, and I won't forget it anytime soon. So
Exactly.
So if you had to start over from scratch, like right now, you lost everything, or pretend you're a 24-year-old right now just getting started, what would you do to get started from scratch?
That's a great question. I have almost lost everything. I have lost everything in the past when I was an entrepreneur in the first 2 businesses. So I know what it's like to start from nothing, not even nothing, but negative balance. So I've kind of been bashed right down, and I've been in that situation where it's not just me thinking I should give up, but everybody around me. So if I was to be in that situation again and to start again, I think the most important thing I could do was to network and to build out my relationship straight off. I guess, if I lost all my relationships as well, I'd have to do that, from scratch. But I think that's the most powerful thing in business is who you know. It's not obvious kind of what the value of those people are earlier on. But like, for example, you and I can have a chat now, and this will be sort of food for thought for me to go away and, write some stuff down, or to, maybe some things that you say might inspire me to think in a certain way. And I think it's so important starting out is to expose yourself to the right people, whether you can do that through going to meetups, through networking events, find a coach, join some community. There's so many opportunities now. That would be the first thing I would do, because then I could understand what was going on, what the opportunities are, like those lessons that we talked about, those, learning about clients. I don't want to have to go through all of that again the hard way. So I'd rather somebody else did that. and I could learn from that experience. So I think if you're in that situation, day one, you've got to network and get out there.
Yeah, and I think that's sometimes a difficult decision to make, to spend time on that, just because if you can think about the ROI of how you're spending your time, right? It's like, I'm going to increase conversion rates on my website by 5%. Exactly. That will yield me something amount in my business, right? But when it comes to like, we're having a conversation today, and the ROI is entirely ambiguous. Like, you can't quantify what will come out of this conversation. But, we might refer each other clients in 2 weeks, who knows? And so it's kind of like a little bit of a roll of the die. And I think that's maybe one of the reasons why, of course, it's easy. I have heard that before as well, but it's still one of those things where you hear it and it kind of goes in one ear and out the other, because it's like unquantifiable. But that being said, I totally agree with what you're saying.
I think you've got to structure it, haven't you? You've got to, the way to do that, I mean, what works for me is to structure my day such that I confine the actual heavy lifting part to a few hours in the day, and leave the rest open to do that stuff, right? Because if you were to just say, right, okay, I've got to increase my conversion rates, I've got to get it to X%, you would spend 24 hours straight doing that. And it's non-stop, isn't it? It just goes on forever, that kind of work, looking at the data and tweaking. And so you've got to ring fence that time and make sure you have time outside of that. So if you were to set, say, 2 hours a day in the morning to do that, whatever your main goal was, and the rest you leave open to do the other stuff, you've got to create a space for the magic to happen. And the magic always happens in the unplanned incidences, right? So I think that's really important, is to structure the unstructured, if that makes sense, because otherwise the low value tasks take over. You end up doing all of that.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I very much agree with that. And this is a realization I've kind of had recently, which is, I'd heard the value of connections before, but then you also hear about like, oh, just, head down, grind through it, and get stuff done, and just work your butt off to get something up when you're launching a new project, right? But then I've kind of started to realize that if I look back over even just the past couple of years, the periods where I had the biggest breakthroughs versus where I almost like stalled out, it actually exactly correlates to when I took time to invest in relationships and when I was just trying to grind it out and focus on, the increasing conversion rate type stuff. And it's funny because in some ways you kind of get that idea out there that just, if you work really hard, you put in the time, and you put in more time, you put in the extra hours, you'll see that return, you'll see that progress. But actually, I've found that that's very linear progress. And if you spend a couple extra hours each day doing it to work long hours, it's like a slightly steeper slope of that progress, right? But it's still very linear. Whereas when it comes to relationships, everything's very exponential, because that might turn into a partnership, that might turn into like new, really effective ideas that you wouldn't come up with on your own. And so then, you may not see immediate return on having a meeting or a coffee with somebody, but if you're regularly investing that time, then all of a sudden that's a very exponential way of going about your day. And so that's something that it took me actually way too long to realize that. And I would also say that if I had to start over, that's something, or if I could tell my younger self something really important, that's one thing that I would focus on as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think you use the term there, investing in relationships is very apt. It's hard to see, especially when you're younger, it's hard to see the value of investing in anything, because you don't have the history to fall back on. And you invest in relationships, you don't understand why you should do something that would pay off in years, maybe. It could be way down the road. You just don't know. But that's the point, isn't it? Is that that's where all wealth is made, is through investment, whether it be in assets or in relationships. And you've got to have that mindset. You've got to have the mindset that is really what your game is about. And the way I look at it, Grant, is this, is that, your business, that grind that you talk about is what creates the income now. But anything above and beyond what you need time-wise, you should be investing in the relationships or assets, right? Because that's what's going to make wealth, right? And I think a lot of entrepreneurs don't get that. They think that business is going to create wealth for them. It doesn't. Business creates an income. What creates wealth is assets. So that's the challenge, I think, and it applies equally to stocks, real estate, as it would to relationships as well. Is that mindset is so important. And you only realize, ironically, 10 years, 15 years later, you've got that sort of history and look back and think, wow, I'm really glad I stuck that out and did that. because that has really put me in a great position, for the long term. It's set me up for life. But it's hard because I think a lot of people are short-term focused, aren't they?
Absolutely. And I think it's a fascinating way of putting it. Again, people get so caught up in just like grinding it out. And I really like the way you put it, that that's a good way to create an income. It's not really wealth. And I think, yeah, that's a good way to maybe marginally increase your business, your revenue, what you're working on. But again, it's not a good way to take it to the next level. You're not going to just grind it out and, tweak conversion rates, tweak headlines, and all of a sudden be on the next level. Take something different, take something stronger.
It's tempting though, isn't it? Because the all the information's there. I've been caught up in that. And I look at it like this. I look at it as alpha and betas. We've got a lot of betas stuff out there, which is all the tweeting, tweaking, all that kind of stuff, the optimization. And they promise, and there's a lot of great stories. I mean, if you go to people like Neil Patel's website, who does Quick Sprout, there's some fantastic stories about how you can grow, 7-figure businesses by tweaking your way up the curve. But for most people, that won't work. Tweaking will only get you marginally up to the next step. But if you want a disruptive shift up to the next level, you've got to focus on the alpha stuff. And it's doing like what you're doing now, like creating a podcast or a video, writing a book, going to a networking meeting, the stuff you can't outsource effectively. Anything that you can outsource will never make you rich. Anything that you have to do yourself, you can't replace yourself to do. That's where the wealth is, the creative freedom, the lifestyle freedom is, right? So, I encourage people to look at how they can create alphas. Those things that you can't have somebody else do, because that's really what your long-term business lifestyle should be built around.
Yeah, very well put. I very much agree with everything you just said. So you brought up an interesting life event, actually, when I asked you this original question, talking about losing everything and being way in the red. I think that's something that probably a lot of people have experienced that or inevitably will experience that. So I'd be interested to hear more about that experience and like what exactly was the challenge that you faced and how did you go? Like, how did you end up there? And then what did you do since then to deal with that?
Well, the first time I ever was in that situation was after that first business back in those .com days, building websites with a good friend. And I think that was a mistake. I went into business with a friend. And, in hindsight, I'd never do that again because, I was young and naive. I didn't have anybody in my network who had business experience. So, that was the natural thing to do, to set up with a friend. And he basically walked out of the business a year into it. He said he didn't want to do this anymore. And I was left with the business and it ran into debt because I didn't have a clue, really. So, after nearly 2 years, I had to close the business and I was seriously in debt. And, I had to basically go back to people that I borrowed money from and explain the situation. That was pretty hard because I'd gone out on a limb in the beginning and said, yeah, I'm going to become an entrepreneur. I'm going to do this. I'm going to become rich. And, and people sort of said, yeah, right. Okay. Let's see how you get on in a year or 2 years' time. And they were right. In their world, they were right because they had the safe jobs and the middle class careers. And here was me trying to do something different. And, I proved them right by screwing up and coming back in debt. And that was a pretty hard lesson to learn because I learned that, it really blows your confidence in that situation. It's not so much the financial aspect, but it's the fact you start having doubts in your head and thinking, actually, maybe I'm not very good at business. Maybe I'm not a Mark Cuban or a Richard Branson, right? So that's hard. I think money aside, it's what it does to your confidence, and confidence is everything in business.
Absolutely. And so did you feel like a failure when that happened?
Yeah, I did very much so. And that was really hard because you look around and you've kind of burnt a lot of bridges as well. Because I'm the kind of guy who goes out there and tells everybody what I'm going to do. So you kind of, in a way, it's a motivating factor as well because you've kind of made a rod for your own back and said, right, I'm going to go and do this. So you've kind of got that motivation. But when it goes wrong, it's hard. Ultimately, I think, your good friends, it doesn't make any difference to them. You find out who your friends really are. And, it's just an interesting curve. It's more of a reckless way to live your life. But that's part of being an entrepreneur. Is that, you don't choose to do things the quiet or easy way.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because I think maybe it's easy to hear about that, like, oh yeah, Graham was in debt and blah blah blah. But yeah, I think you hit on a really good point, which is the bigger hardship is actually how you feel about that, because it's not just like, oh man, I got to work extra hard to pay off this debt. It's like, wow, I feel like a complete failure. I feel humiliated because everybody knows I just screwed this up, even though I just so confidently said I was going to succeed. And those kinds of emotional challenges and psychological challenges, I think, are not to be underestimated, because that's a good point for many people where they would just give up.
Yeah, and go back. Well, that's what a lot of people around me did. They went back to normality, quote unquote. It's that they went back to a safe job because they couldn't handle. It's not just that sort of first year of being in business. That's sort of the ongoing aspect of being in business, isn't it? It's that you're constantly faced with this. Even now, in my situation, I face those kind of on a micro level, mini crises and so on, which wouldn't happen if I was running, a normal life and a normal job. So I think you become used to it and learn how to deal with that. You realize that actually this is how it's going to be for the rest of your life. Like, you're going to face this lack of security, and you just got to get used to it. If you can't deal with that, then you've got to go back to a normal job. But it's never going to be in a situation where you start a business, you become successful, you sell out, and you arrive. That's it. You put your feet up and it's, sail off into the sunset. That's so rare in business. Most people are involved in, even people who are in that situation choose to go back into business.
Yeah.
And choose to be constantly involved.
But although the caveat to that is that, so I agree, and that's so true, but that is also the sales copy of many a sales pages that actually does happen, right? So, but I think it's a good point, is that doesn't happen. It sounds kind of bleak, I suppose, because it's like, wow, things will be stressful and difficult forever. But right. I think the flip side to that is actually in some ways, it makes you very much stronger. Like, I guess some people, it's not for them, of course, and they learn that. And they learn that they can't or don't want to handle that, which is fine if that's what's for them. But the flip side is that I think it kind of pushes you to be more psychologically strong, to be able to be more calm in the face of extreme stress, and develop all these skill sets that you would never develop in a traditional job, traditional career.
For sure. That's the sort of the soft, fuzzy part that people don't often think about when they go into business, but I think ultimately that's what it's all about. I think there was a survey some years ago, I can't remember the source, something like a PwC or something, that surveyed entrepreneurs and asked them about their motivations for going into business. And it was interesting that they found, Grant, that most entrepreneurs who went into business by themselves earned pretty much the same as what they would have earned if they had stuck it out in a career. That's most, not all. So money was the least motivating factor in the long term. And what people talked about was the creative freedom. And I think that ultimately what it comes down to, isn't it? Look, we spend 60, 70% of our lives working, right? I mean, I'm talking like from the moment you get up till you go to bed. So there's a huge difference in getting up in the morning and thinking, yeah, I feel really inspired to do something creative today. And so getting into the car, driving to the office and dreading facing, the boss and that kind of thing. So you've got to say, well, this is going to be 40 years of my life. I've got to do something that I want to do, right? Rather than sort of waiting for being 65 years old and then sort of enjoying the golden years when you're too old and too broken physically to do it. So that's what it comes down to, being an entrepreneur, is effectively what you want to do. And it's that creative freedom that you can't get anywhere else. And that is worth more than money. And I think the older you get, the more you realize how important that is.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to jump on that, on sort of two things you've said now, is that one, you said you realize that you can kind of go through a life as an entrepreneur and never have a complete sense of security or certainty, right? Just because of the very nature of it. But the flip side is that you have opportunities to creatively express yourself, to work on things that matter to you. And so the way I would put that is to grow. Because to sort of relate this back to some things I've been thinking about recently, is my personal values and needs very much revolve around, actually, interestingly enough, certainty, but also growth as well. And in some sense, there's a lack of certainty, right, in entrepreneurship, as you mentioned, but there's so much growth if you do it right. And so it is scary and stressful at times, for sure. I think it is for everybody, but the sense of growth you get from it is fantastic. And it's a great trade-off, and I really love it because of that.
I think you can't have one without the other, can you? Is it possible? I don't think you can have growth in a comfortable world. So it has to
It's a
be
good
like
point.
that.
Yeah, absolutely. So what would you recommend to people who are interested in taking, so for example, you focus a lot on marketing. So, right. So you used to have the skill set of, IT, website building. And so you turned that into a business. And nowadays you focus on the skill set and the knowledge about marketing, and you have turned that into a business in terms of consulting, et cetera. So what would you recommend to people who might be out there who have a specific skill set, who might be an expert in a particular industry, but they've not yet found a way to turn that into a viable business? And I realize it's kind of a general question because I'm sure the answer would depend on the industry, but just if you have any general feedback on people who've, they've kind of got the skill set, they've kind of got the knowledge, but they haven't really successfully turned that into a profitable business.
Right. So if you have a skill, let's say you know how to design wedding cakes, or you're into nutrition or life coach, or you develop apps, whatever it might be, the absolute number one skill that you need to learn to turn that into a business is how to sell. And there are many different ways that you can sell. There's the traditional way of getting on the phone and cold calling people, which is less of a thing these days, but it's still a sales skill. The other way is to learn how to set up a website, set up a list, and get people onto that list and sell to them on that list. It's not the hard sell in the first instance, but it's still selling. Unless you know how to sell, then all your knowledge is worthless, because even if you're writing a book, right, it's always best-selling author, not best-written author, right? So it's so important to have that skill and to be able to turn your skill, your domain knowledge into something that people understand and people want to buy. So my advice would be learn how to sell. What can you do to learn how to sell your stuff, right? And as I said, there are many different ways that you can do that, but that would be the first point that you need to take, the first step to turn from being an employee in an organization to somebody who's got some kind of control and some kind of extra income stream.
Yeah, that's great advice. And I've actually worked previously with a girl here locally in Chiang Mai to work with her to set up a business. And it was interesting because she's very knowledgeable about fitness and nutrition. And she's like, okay, I want to, turn this into a business. And then when it came time to actually, inevitably sell a product, right? That's what any business does. They either sell a service or sell a product. And when it came time to do that, she kind of was like really scared to actually go out and do that, to message people, to email people, to call people. And it was interesting because a lot of the things she said involved feeling very like sleazy, like she was just like pressuring her friends to buy something, and like she was being unethical, and she had all these interesting emotions, which actually I remembered having too when I first got started, because if you're trying to do something that's focused on expertise, right? There's like this weird sense of like, oh, I need to keep it pure. I don't need to actually like be a salesman, right? Because we have this weird concept of what money means, of what businesses mean, of what selling means. But in reality, again, the world and the world economy is driven by businesses which sell things. And at the end of the day, there's nothing inherently unethical about that. It just depends. I mean, you can do it unethically, but you can also do it very ethically in ways that really genuinely improve people's lives. So I think that's interesting that she had that kind of emotional reaction. I think that's pretty common.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, for sure. You're right. We have a notion about what sales is, and we tend to think of the cheesy, plastic suit sales guy working for the realtor or, the agent. And that's kind of what we think of sales. But, the thing is, Grant, that the number one and only reason businesses fail is lack of sales. The fact that their costs are higher than their sales. So, sales is everything in business. And I think that's hard for somebody who's not used to selling. If you've worked for somebody else most of your life, the organization did the selling for you. You're probably not used to that situation. I think we have to realize that they're also, to your contact running the nutrition business, for her, to open up the world of sales and realize it's not just the traditional world of selling, picking up the phone and making 100 calls, which I learned. I learned that way of selling originally, and I think it's a fantastic training. But it's applicable only in very few circumstances. There are many different ways to sell these days. Writing a book is selling, as far as I'm concerned. If you can write a book, you're having a conversation with somebody in that book, and you're selling yourself in that book. If you've got products or a next step in that book, that's a sales process, right?
Yeah, actually, I want to pick up on that, and I want to say, sort of extend that point further, which I think I would venture that a great many of things in everyday life are actually a form of sales.
Yeah.
When you ask that cute girl for her number across the bar, right, or whatever you're doing in your spare time, you have to sell that person on the proposition of, yeah, I'm worthwhile to give me your number, versus I'm knowledgeable enough and I have a good enough product for you to give me your money, right? It's actually like a very natural thing that happens in everyday life, and everybody's constantly doing it, but they just don't see it that way, which I find really interesting.
So here's the other thing as well. That's a great example about asking a girl in a bar. And I think, it explains why we live by selling. And there's also another interesting angle in that, is that a lot of people feel very uncomfortable in that situation. And, they imagine that the ground opening up and being swallowed alive when she knocks you back, all that kind of thing, from early experience at school, that kind of thing. But there's other ways of doing it as well. I mean, I was never very good at walking up to girls in bars and asking for their numbers. And I learned that very early on in my teenage life. So you develop other strategies. I would write girls poems, and that would sell. So, because that was different. So I think, there's other ways of doing it as well. And I think that sort of reflects in business life, is that, you don't just have to have that do or die situation. There's other ways of doing it. So
interesting. Yeah. I guess you could compare the writing a poem for a girl to like an opt-in bribe or something like that, like giving them something that they like, that's interesting, that they want, in exchange for moving forward through whatever process you're trying to go through.
Exactly. It was like a newsletter before they even invented the internet. So
old school newsletter.
It was analog.
Nice. So generally speaking, time to move into some general questions that I always find really interesting. What would you say motivates you? Pursue this path, or in life in general, what are some things that motivate you every day?
I hadn't thought about that recently. I've been so involved in settling here in Spain and trying to find things. I've kind of, you forget about these things. But to answer your question, I like to do something different, a challenge. I'm very into challenges. I think if something isn't a challenge, I get bored. Whether that's business, business is a challenge as much as you want to make it, or in life, doing an Ironman triathlon, that kind of thing. I enjoy stuff that's hard and difficult because I feel a real reward, a satisfaction in mastering that. And that, I think, is a real motivator for me. I mean, everything else sort of falls around that. Moving here to Spain, obviously I want to create a good life for my family. These are all things that really motivate me. Money is a side motivation. I think anybody that says money's not a motivation is a liar, because, it's no fun being broke in paradise. You've got to have a certain amount of money to make this work, but it's not what I get out of bed for. And it's really that challenge that makes it happen for me. So
do you think if you had, say, $100 million, you would kind of operate similarly? I mean, of course, everybody would do something different, whether it's like go on extra cruises or buy a plane. But generally speaking, do you think you'd kind of pursue the same types of challenges and projects?
A bit different, because I'm in a fortunate situation now where, over the years I invested in real estate with the income from my business, and sort of, I'm in a situation now where I suppose I'm financially independent through, just prudent investing over those years. So I kind of have a little bit of bandwidth now to do things that I wouldn't probably do 20 years ago. I sort of do projects that interest me rather than projects that are, directly revenue generating day one. So that's kind of a difference. And in a way, that may be a downfall as well, because, I may just do stuff because it's interesting and not, generating money. But that for me is the challenge. I enjoy that. I'd like to have stuff which is, mentally rewarding. So yeah, it is different when you have money. You will choose different things because it comes back to that saying no. You've got more bandwidth to say no now. You don't have to take on that client or have to take on that project just because you need to pay the bills. So it does change your mindset. But fundamentally, I think, it really just helps you focus on the options rather than changes them entirely.
Yeah, and actually, so that reminds me of I think this. So Dan Andrews at Tropical MBA, I think this is what he calls FU money. So like, if you've got enough money, you have the ability to say FU to like anything you don't want to do, because now you have the bandwidth to say yes to the things you truly want,
Yeah.
and say no to anything you don't want to do, irregardless of how much money it would generate.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, that's a good way of putting it. I had to
Definitely
remember
sticks in your mind.
Yeah.
That's why I liked it.
Exactly.
So we've got what motivates you now. Now let's talk briefly, just kind of as a couple wrap up points. I'm interested in some of the habits that you've developed over the years that you would say are conducive to success, or at least help keep you on track.
So what kind of habits do I practice on a daily basis? That's what you're interested in, right?
Yeah, so maybe morning rituals,
Right.
or like reading a bit on the weekends, or traveling a certain way. Anything that's a habitual part of your routine, your life, that you think very much refreshes you or helps you grow, helps you move forward.
Yeah, I like to structure what I do because I like to structure it to enable time for the unstructured, if that makes sense. Because if you don't structure anything, then the chaos takes over. You know, you respond to emails and you respond to phone calls and you don't get to do what you want to do. So I'm a big fan of using calendars like Google Calendar. I use that every day, and that is always open on my desktop. And that will tell me what I need to do in certain times. It's not really specific. I haven't planned it down to a T. But for example, if I said like between 9 and 11, I'm working on this project, I'll do that. And that helps me, make sure that I work on that project at a certain time. And also it allows me to keep focused, so I'm not off doing other things. So I'm a real big fan of planning that. And I'm constantly tweaking the calendar. In the morning, one of the first things that I'll do is I'll review my goals. So I have a document. I use Google Docs, or Google Drive it is now, and write down all my goals. So at 7:30 in the morning, the first thing I'll do is I'll open that document and just go through it and review it. Even if I spend 10, 15 minutes doing that, that really helps me keep focused. I think one of the biggest books that ever inspired me, and I recommend it to any of your listeners, is Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. It's a little bit old these days, but it really sort of changed my mindset. And one of the things he says in that is that, you know, if you're flying a plane, you spend 95% of your time off course, and you spend 95% of your time just correcting your heading to head back to the destination. Otherwise, you get buffeted, you get blown around by the winds of circumstance, right? And if you're working for yourself, it's all winds of circumstances. It's, you know, a mini crisis, a mini problem all the time. So having that discipline and that routine of every morning looking at that goals document and reviewing your goals on a daily basis is, for me, like resetting my heading, turning back towards the destination that I want to go to. There are a number of other habits, but if you were to pick the 2 that I use and I think have worked for me and I've been using over 10 years, is that writing down your goals and reviewing them every morning, and then using a calendar to structure your day.
Yeah, I mean, those, in some ways, those are so simple, but so effective. I absolutely agree with that. And one of the things I've noticed myself is that, so I used to spend a lot of time just always kind of, in a sense, working, in the sense that I would, you know, I have my projects. I was always trying to move forward on my projects, right? And as I get older and more quote unquote wise, I find myself spending a larger and larger percentage of my time in that planning, reviewing, goal setting kind of mode. And you know, it's not, sometimes it's like 2 hours actually in an evening, and that's the most productive work I do all day, but it's insanely effective. And that's not something I ever would have thought several years ago, that that's a good way to spend my time, right? In some ways, when you first start doing that, it feels like you're wasting time or you're not really working or something, but it's actually insanely effective, because what it does then, at the very least, it does a lot of things, but it prevents you from wasting, you know, weeks on the wrong types of things. And so that act of intentionally screening is insanely effective and is just a huge time saver.
I believe that 2 hours is probably worth 20 hours of work during the week. That it's so effective. And I'm like you, I'm a great believer.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell me a bit about some of the projects you're working on now and how people can sort of follow what you're doing. I know you got Barefoot Radio, but I know you also have a lot of projects. So if you want to talk a bit about what you're working on and how people can get in touch with you and follow your projects, that'd be great.
The easiest way to get in touch with me is to go to barefootjournal.com Sign up to the newsletter. You'll just get an update on the weekly shows that we do. That's the best way to connect with me on the personal level, to see what I'm doing and, what I'm kind of doing in my travels as well. And from that, it will branch out to the other projects. But that's the best starting point. If you want to learn how to become a bit more location independent in your life, take a bit more control in your business and understand a bit more about marketing, then that's where you should start.
Nice. And so 2 final questions. One, why do you call it Barefoot Radio? Or did you used to be like into barefoot running or something?
No, a lot of people ask me that. I think it's an interesting thing because, although I'm a runner, I'm never really into barefoot running. It's called barefoot because barefoot shoes were to me like the BS of the mediocre modern world. It's like if you go to a beach, you can't go on a beach with a nice pair of shoes. It goes back to a story when I was in India and I went down to Goa on business, and I only brought with me a really nice pair of shoes, and these were really nice shoes. These were Jeffrey West shoes that cost several $100s, and I couldn't go on the beach because I was scared about getting these shoes damaged by the sand and so on. But it was a beautiful white sand beach, and it was just for me like a realization: well, take the shoes off, go and enjoy. And that was kind of like a mental an embodiment of my career. Is that I was kind of worried so much about these material aspects or these labels and these titles of business and what people thought of me, that I wasn't able to enjoy what was out there.
That's fantastic. And by the way, it was not a critique. I actually really liked the branding. I was just curious about the story behind it because I figured you had some kind of experience like that inspired the name.
Yeah, there you go.
So final question, what do you got coming up over the next year in terms of travel, projects, anything exciting coming up?
Yeah, I've got a couple of projects. I'll be based here in Spain for the long term, so that enables me to focus a bit more on these projects. I've got a project coming out this summer, and it's a guide for startups, which basically helps them choose where they can start up their business. And Grant, you've been very helpful in contributing to that guide, so that will be out soon. Yeah, no, it's great. So it's kind of like, what we want to do is help people who are a bit further up the stream, if you like, and who want to know, okay, right, I'm just graduating or I'm still an employee or starting my business. Where can I go in the world to start up my business? Everybody's going here, or is that the best place I can go? So, we talk about what it's like to start a business in Chiang Mai, Saigon, Bali, all these popular places, as well as Barcelona here in Spain and so on. So that's coming out. I also have another project, which is sort of on the back of that, but hey, let's just do one thing at a time because I'm obviously aware of the time. So yeah, that's the main thing that I'm working on right now.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I think today we had the fortunate opportunity to go through a lot of really valuable lessons learned over the course of your career. And I think people probably got a lot of value out of what we talked about today. So I really appreciate you coming on today. And to all you people who've been listening, I hope you really take to heart the things that he said, because Graham touched on a lot of really good points today that I think are vital to be an extremely successful entrepreneur. So thanks again for joining me, Graham.
That was a real pleasure. Thank you, Grant.
Hey, entrepreneurs and experts, I just wanted to thank you for listening to this episode, and I hope you learned at least one new big idea that helps you evolve your skills and gets you closer to monetizing your expertise and creating that successful knowledge business. Make sure to hit that subscribe button on iTunes and Stitcher, and check out myepodcast.com for all episodes as well as the tips and tricks mentioned in this episode. Thanks again, and I'll see you next week.